Atraxa, Praetor's voice, has continued to maintain her position as the most popular commander of all time for 8 years, according to the EDHREC data. This celebrity comes largely from her open-endedness, color access, and versatility, having an end-step proliferate trigger and 4 relevant keywords. Flying, Vigilance, Death Touch, and Lifelink are all incredibly potent keyword abilities, making her a tremendous threat in combat. But as we approach the end of 2024, I thought it would be a fun yearly tradition to once again check in on everyone's favorite Phyrexian Angel horror. Oh. In March of 2024, we saw the release of the Universes Beyond Fallout set, perhaps my favorite UB set thus far, and one of my favorite sets of 24 in general. In it, we got a precon deck centered around a mechanic called radiation counters, or rad counters for short. I grew up in the late 90s, so I will spare you my stupid puns for the moment. These radiation counters represented nuclear radiation after the global shindig gone wrong present in the Fallout series. Mechanically, they are a type of counter given to a player. And at the beginning of each player's pre-combat main phase, they mill cards equal to the number of their rad counters. For each non-land card milled in this manner, that player loses 1 life and loses 1 rad counter. So like radiation, it does have a half-life that goes away after a time. Rad counters introduced a bit more of an aggressive mill strategy. Before that, mill was often a slower, more passive strategy, utilizing cards that milled opponents without a lot of creature-based aggression. But with the Fallout set, we got a bunch of cards that offered rad counters as a means to mill the entire table while still going on the attack. For this video, I want to utilize Atraxa to expand upon rad counters as the deck's main engine. Atraxa's proliferate ability will come into relevance here, giving players extra rad counters and giving our own creatures extra +1/+1 counters. We're going to break this deck down into a few main parts. Cards to give radiation counters to players, which is really key to making everything come together. Cards to take advantage of milling, either by forcing mill or utilizing cards in the bin, and how we win with the deck. So starting off, let's discuss cards that give us radiation. Most of these, if not all, can be found in the Wise Mothman's precon deck. Bloatfly Swarm is a 4-mana 0/0 with flying that enters with 5 +1/+1 counters. If damage would be dealt to the Bloatfly Swarm while it has a +1/+1 counter on it, you prevent that damage, remove that many +1/+1 counters from it, and then give each player a rad counter for each +1/+1 counter removed this way. This could be quite the pest to drop in early, having flying and a reasonable body when we factor in the counters. What makes this a great option is that if our opponents manage to block this thing, they're going to be giving the table radiation counters, which will eventually help our deck out. This is also a great proliferate target for Atraxa, as we can restock those +1/+1 counters. Pharaoh Ghoul gets a +1/+1 counter on it whenever one of our creatures die, and when the ghoul dies, each opponent gets a number of rad counters equal to its power. At the very minimum, they'll be getting 2, but the larger our Pharaoh Ghoul is, the more radiation counters they'll take. Glowing One is a personal favorite, having Death Touch, and whenever it connects to an opponent, they get 4 radiation counters. Whenever a player mills a non-land card, we gain 1 life. This gives us extra benefit to our radiation milling as we gain life, effectively negating the life loss from those counters. Infesting Radroach is a 2/2 with flying and can't block. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, they get that many radiation counters. Also, whenever an opponent mills a non-land card, if the Radroach is in our graveyard, we can return it to our hand. This thing is a menace. There are a few things in Commander as threatening as giving a player that many of something, and giving a player rad counters equal to the number of damage this thing deals can be brutal. We have a small +1/+1 sub-strategy in this deck, so bulking up the Radroach will make it an amazing asset, dishing out damage and handing out rad counters like bottle caps at market. Mirelurk Queen enters and gives a target player 2 rad counters. Then, whenever 1 or more non-land cards are milled, we draw a card and put a +1/+1 counter onto our queen. This translates into a nasty card draw engine for our deck. Even though the draw ability will only trigger once per turn, each opponent will at least mill once per turn, potentially drawing us a card each time. All the while, this thing grows larger and more threatening. Nightkin Ambusher has War 2, love it, and when it enters, target player gets 4 rad counters. Lastly, it can't be blocked as long as the defending player has a rad counter. This card is rude. You give a player a rad counter, and then unless they get rid of it by the time your next turn comes around, this creature will be able to sneak in for a hefty chunk of damage. Screeching Scorch Beast is a 5/5 with both flying and menace, so good luck blocking that. Whenever it attacks, each player gets 2 radiation counters. Whenever 1 or more non-land cards are milled, you may create that many 2/2 black zombie mutant creature tokens, but do this only once per turn. Another powerful payoff to our Rads forcing mill, this will give us untapped zombie mutant tokens and another instance of creating that many of something. Potato Farmer has a landfall ability giving us 2 radiation counters if we want them. We can also tap the farmer to put a land card that was milled this turn onto the battlefield under our control, being a very interesting way to snatch up lands from our bin or our opponents. The Wise Mothman is largely the kingpin of this deck, having an ETB and attack trigger of giving each player a rad counter. Next, whenever one or more non-land cards are milled, we may put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to X target creatures, where X is the number of non-land cards milled this way. This thing is largely the engine by which we get extra +1/+1 counters dished out, giving counters out each time someone mills a non-land card. Cards like the Bloatflies that give out additional rad counters based on how large they are excellent targets for this. Not to mention Atraxa will be able to proliferate everything, rad counters, +1/+1 counters, just to make things more interesting. Vexing Radgall has a unique modal combat trigger. If they don't have any rad counters, if this thing connects, they get 2. If they do have rad counters, we simply proliferate. Both seems pretty good. Nuke Launcher is one of 3 equipment spells in the deck, giving the equipped creature +3/+0 and gives it Intimidate. Whenever the equipped creature attacks, until the end of the defending player's next turn, they get 2 radiation counters whenever they cast a spell. This is fun since they're going to be gaining a lot more rad counters during their turn, even if they've lost any pre-existing rad counters during their main phase. Since we've already passed their mill instance, they will maintain those radiation counters until their next turn. Struggle for Project Purity is a 4-mana enchantment with 2 modes you choose to use. Brotherhood gives you an upkeep trigger, allowing each opponent to draw a card, and then you draw a card for each card drawn this way. Super powerful card draw, very helpful. Or you could choose Enclave, where whenever a player attacks you with one or more of their creatures, that player gets twice that many rad counters. You could choose to give the table some card draw on the condition that you'll be drawing cards as well, or you can put up a Pillow Fort style ability that will dish out a hefty chunk of rad counters should you be attacked. Lastly, we have Vault 12 the Necropolis, a saga enchantment with 3 chapters. Chapter 1 gives each player 3 rad counters. At Chapter 2, you create X 2/2 zombie mutant creature tokens, where X is the total number of rad counters among players. Chapter 3 puts 2 +1/+1 counters onto each creature you control that's either a zombie or a mutant. Good gods, I love this card. Most of the creatures in this deck are mutants, and so this will just give out counters to more than just those zombie tokens we've created. Now let's talk mill. We have more mill cards than simply the ones giving out the radiation counters, and these will often trigger some of the cards we've already discussed. Consuming Aberration is a 5-mana horror whose power and toughness are equal to the number of cards in opponents' graveyards. Whenever you cast a spell, each opponent reveals cards off the top of their library until they reveal a land card, and then all of those cards go to the graveyard. Now, this isn't technically mill, and so it won't trigger our other cards, but it is still a tremendously brutal card. We will get each opponent to drain their libraries each time we cast a spell, and this thing's just going to get larger and larger. Raoul, Troubleshooter, has an activated ability that forces each player to mill a card. You may also, once per turn, cast a spell from among the cards in your graveyard that were milled there this turn. This is very relevant to recursion in the event that you mill something you didn't want to mill, which does happen quite a bit. The Mind Skinner is a 10/1 for 3 blue mana that can't be blocked. Good lord. If a source that you control would deal damage to an opponent, you prevent that damage, and each opponent mills that many cards. This card is so much fun in this deck. First of all, it attacking will force each opponent to mill at least 10 cards, wiping out a 10th of each opponent's total library. Secondly, while it does somewhat nombo with cards that need to deal combat damage to do stuff, this will turn all of our damage into additional mill, and quite possibly winning us the game with that. We also have cards like Dreamtide Whale and Evolution Sage to give us extra proliferate triggers, which can be very helpful to maintain a healthy amount of radiation on the table alongside of what our commander's proliferate triggers do. We also run Agent Frank Horrigan, a tremendous 8/6 with Trample. As long as he's attacked this turn, he has Indestructible. Lastly, whenever he enters or attacks, we proliferate twice. This can be a deadly means to up everything in play, from +1/+1 counters to radiation counters to poison counters. Yes, I said poison counters. The scenario I specifically included Agent Frank Horrigan for was to equip him with the grafted exoskeleton, which is an equipment that gives the equipped creature +2/+2 and infect. This would mean that he would attack, proliferate whatever we choose to, twice, and then he could possibly be dealing up to 10 poison damage in one swing, taking a player completely out of the game in one shot. Yes, he is a hefty boy at 7 mana, but I really like what he brings to the table. Along those same lines, we do have a pair of alternate win conditions. Laboratory Maniac is insurance for our mill should we overextend our milling and accidentally deck ourselves out. Simic Ascendancy will play off of our +1/+1 counter strategy, winning us the game should it have 20 or more growth counters on it, getting a growth counter for each +1/+1 counter that we put onto our creatures while it's out. Now, while they don't technically contribute to any one part of the strategy, I personally liked to include Sublime Archangel and Noble Hierarch as 2 means to give an exalted buff to one of our attacking creatures, should they attack solo. My normal playstyle with these kind of decks is to not attack with all of my creatures, and having 2 cards reward a creature going in solo can make for some unique interactions. If we're attacking with only our Infesting Radroach or our Feral Ghoul or even the Mind Skinner, this can help scale their abilities and deal out additional damage. Now, playing this deck is rather interesting. You can keep Atraxa in the command zone until she is needed, since her proliferate trigger happens at the end step. You'll want to get out some cards that will give out rad counters early game. Once you do, you can continue to proliferate the ones that stick around. If an opponent doesn't mill any non-land cards, they retain those rad counters, and so during our turn, we can proliferate them to make it worse for our opponents. A great number of our cards just have proliferate tacked onto them, giving us whatever ability they do, and then we proliferate. Kind of like a final kick in the shin, really. Should we have a well-developed turn and have casted several spells, we can chain a Rad Storm to give us multiple proliferations on a single card. One thing to note about this is that in my experience, and in researching and discussing the experiences of others, the Rad counter take on mill feels like less of a buzzkill than some other approaches to mill. Atraxa offering us white access doesn't quite open the doors so much to additional rad counter strategies or even mill, since white doesn't do much of that anyway, but what it did offer was a lot more interaction. We have some classic 1-drop removal spells in white to supplement the usual cards we run in black. Cards like Teferi's Protection and Dawn's Truce will help us keep our board state intact, as we do run the possibility of attracting quite a bit of hate if for no other reason than we're running Atraxa as our commander. We do also gain access to Smothering Tithe, and while I normally would be hesitant to run such staples as Teferi's Protection or Smothering Tithe, I feel like since we're on Atraxa as commander, we can make the singular exception and run some of the better cards. We are largely in a mid-range wheelhouse, and so having more ways to accelerate our mana is ideal to get our board state up and running. But for now, that will come to a close at this year's look at Atraxa Praetor's Voice. How do you feel about Atraxa at this point in time? Do you still like her? Have you grown to dislike her? I know she's kind of dead in the storyline, so RIP in peace, but I think it's interesting to take a look back every once in a while and see if this card can still warrant its popularity. I hope you enjoyed this video. If so, remember to like and share as it helps us out tremendously. If you're new, I hope you'll subscribe and stick around. And as always, I appreciate you spending time with me today. My name is Flynn, and I'll catch you all in the next video.